Well, I'd like to begin too by just saying thank you to all the sponsors that have made this possible, the Taxpayers Federation. Thank you, Gordon, for that very lovely introduction. And most of all, though, thank you to all of you, not just for being here, but almost everyone in this room that I can identify with has made your own contributions to the political process, to conservatism, to some of these adventures we've been on, and we just want this to be a thank you to you and a tribute to you. The reason I went on that Air Farce thing is that at that time Air Farce's viewing audience was 4.5 million compared to the 3 million for the CBC News. So if you had a choice, you're better to be on Air Farce. And I do bring you greetings from my wife Sandra. We're in Vancouver and Victoria tomorrow. She's in Vancouver right now. I don't always bring Sandra along because when I first ran in Calgary Southwest, my campaign manager, Harry Robinson, some of you might remember, Harry came to me and says, we can't bring Sandra along anymore. I says, well, why is that? He says, because people are coming up to me and saying, why isn't she the candidate instead of the policy wonk? So, but anyway, we'll see Sandra tomorrow, but she brings her greetings. This book of mine is entitled Do Something, and it's basically prompted by two concerns. One is the concern that democracy is in trouble. There's an increasing skepticism on part of large numbers of people that democracy is not working, a lack of faith in the democratic chambers, in politicians, political parties, even in elections. And so I've collected a whole bunch of ideas on how could you stimulate or strengthen interest in democracy and a functioning democracy, and that's what's in this book. And then the second thing, the political parties, whether people like them or not, are an integral part of the democratic system, and because we've been identified with the conservative side of the House, and I think there's a lot can be done to strengthen conservatism. In the last century, conservatives won 1 out of 3 elections, federally and provincially. Our aim is for them to win 2 out of 3 in the 21st century, but a lot of work has to be done in that connection. So basically the book is full of suggestions and ideas that I've collected on both those two themes, and it's got this imperative. I worry, particularly with younger people that are involved with the social media, that there's a tendency today to substitute discussion, blogging, tweeting, talking about it, but not doing anything. In fact, there's a lot of people who think they've done something because they've emailed or clicked on something. And there's a place for that, but this is almost all written in the imperative. If you're concerned about any of the things, go out and do something, and there's a few suggestions in there. Just to give you an example, some samples of what's in this thing, on the democracy side, I got a suggestion on particularly communicating democracy to younger people, even to children. You can't present democracy as a legal, dry thing like that. You just turn audiences off. But if you tell us a story, a 26th century old story, a dramatic story, started in Greece, and I think if you tell us a story rather than as a sort of political doctrine, you get further. One of the other points I make is today's science is such a huge force and has something to say on everything, but there's a gap between the science community and the political community. In that parliament, we're just in Ottawa, there wouldn't be more than half a dozen people with any kind of a science background at all. At the Canadian Science Policy Conference, which is a big conference held in Ottawa, there wouldn't be more than a dozen politicians at it. It's all scientists. And I think there's a lot can be done to bridge that gap. Also millennials. We did a survey a number of years ago, or not that long ago, of millennials, because millennials, as a voting bloc, if they ever voted in large numbers, they would be the biggest single bloc, but they're not voting. And one of the questions we asked in this survey was, where do you put yourself on the left, center, right spectrum? And one of the main responses is, we don't like that spectrum. You old guys talk incessantly about politics in terms of left, right, center. We don't connect to it. So we did a fair amount of work on trying to define other axes that millennials might relate to, and suggest to the parties that if you conduct your conversation in those axes, you'll get more buy-in from millennials. But the main point I want to make with respect to the democracy, how can you strengthen democracy, has to do with the need for efforts to raise the knowledge and skill levels and ethical foundational levels of the political class, of people that run for politics. To become a barista at Starbucks, you need 15 hours of training to know the difference between a latte and a mocha. You can become a lawmaker in this legislature here or that Parliament of Canada without 1 hour of training in lawmaking. You know, is that good? I've known members of Parliament that have arrived in Parliament and they put this bill on their desk and they say, "What's that?" Your job is to make statute law. You're one of the only people that can do it. But of course, to be fair, it's not that the people are stupid. The parties never talk about that. It's about winning elections, knocking on doors, communicating, giving speeches. But so there's a lot that can be done to strengthen the knowledge and skills and the ethical foundation of the political class. When I got out of the Parliament, or Sanders says I shouldn't say that because it sounds like I was in the penitentiary, but when I left the Parliament, I did a survey. I asked questions I surveyed the Speaker and the Clerk of the House of Commons, the 10 provincial legislatures and the 3 territorial legislatures. I asked them, said, "You've seen hundreds of people come through your chambers, and you've seen the state of unpreparedness. If you could suggest courses, material, subject matter that would help people get prepared, what would it be?" And I got a list of about 25 things. And I've taken that to Carleton University. It's been incorporated to some extent in their graduate program in political management. The Institute for Future Legislators at UBC is doing a little bit with that. But the big thing I'm working on there with UBC is we're trying to create a 100-seat replica of the House of Commons, actual replica of the House of Commons, with everything, with the media rooms, with committee rooms, caucus rooms, and everything, as a heavy-duty training center for people that think they want to get into an elected assembly. And all of this, the intent is try to raise the knowledge and skill levels of the political class. And I ask if you want to do something, try to encourage that sort of thing. If someone comes knocking on your door and says they want to be a member of Parliament or the legislature, ask them, have you prepared yourself? What preparation have you done? The old Roman senator Cicero, who was ambitious as the dickens to get into the Roman Forum, the great arena of his day, he spent 10 years preparing to get there, and he wrote in his diary, and I would like to inscribe this over the door of the House of Commons: enter, intrate parity, in Latin, enter prepared, enter prepared. So that's some of the stuff on democracy. On the conservative side, and I could go on a little, and I'm conscious here, most of you are standing here, so I hope I'm not prevailing on your strength, but here's some of the things on the conservative side I think can be done. One of the things I distinguish between the movement and the parties. We have a pyramid diagram that we use and put the political party at the pinnacle of the pyramid. But for them to be successful, there's a whole bunch of other stuff underneath. There's the think tanks, the advocacy groups, the communicators, the fundraisers. There's a whole bunch of stuff underneath what we call the movement. And the CTF is a movement organization. And the stronger these movement organizations are, so they can deliver intellectual capital, train people, money, whatever, to the parties, the more successful the parties will be. So I say strengthening conservatism is not just a matter of strengthening the parties. In fact, almost a higher priority is strengthening that movement component below them. Political realignments. I've been involved in trying to put 2 or 3 parties together. First attempt here was actually in Alberta in the 60s here. Joe Clark and I and Merv Leach and another fellow tried to put the Social Credit and the Progressive Conservative parties together before Peter Lougheed got in the legislature. It was completely unsuccessful, and our report was completely rejected by the leadership of both parties. And was not only rejected, they told us, this is my father and Peter Lougheed, told us, we want you to burn this documentation. Because if it ever got out, it's damaging to everybody. Joe lived at an apartment not far from the buildings here, and the incinerator was out in a visible place. It was not good for Joe and I to be seen together, so we couldn't use that incinerator. But my folks had this dairy farm. Some people here reference to this out northeast of Edmonton, and they had this ranch house with a fireplace in it. So Joe and I carted all this stuff out there and carefully fed it all into the fire. 20 years later, my mother's watching on television as Joe gets elected as Prime Minister of Canada. She says, "Isn't that young guy that was..." It's democracy in Canada. Yeah, anyway, political realignments, there's a place for that. And that one wasn't successful, but the attempt to put the Reform Party together with some of the provincial Conservative parties, and then that created the alliance, and then putting that together with the federal Conservatives created a new party, Conservative Party of Canada. United Conservative Party here in Alberta was one of these alignments. Saskatchewan Party is the same way. It's an amalgamation of three things. The Yukon Party is another one. And you don't want to do these political alignments every Thursday, but every 10, 15 years, there's a time to look at the structures and get the structures right. So I got a whole bunch of stuff on that. Maybe one just last point, and I'll get to what I think are the main ones. Municipal politics. Conservatives have tended to neglect municipal politics, and yet the lawyers say it's the third level of government because it's a creation of the municipal acts of the provinces. I say it's the first level of government because it's the level of government that's closest to the people. Democracy was invented not at a federal or a empire level. It was invented at the city-state level in Greece. There's over 5,000 municipal governments in Canada. Most of them have 5 to 6 councillors in them. So that's 30,000 elected officials. In many of those council wards and things like that, there's 4 or 5 people thought of running it. So your thing is 75 to 100,000 people thought of running for elected democratic office, not at the federal or provincial levels, at that municipal level. And I think Conservatives got to do a lot more to try to be involved at that municipal level, and I got a section on that. Now, with respect to strengthening Conservatives, if I had to pick out of that what's the most important thing, I think I'd stress this need for networking that Troy referred to. The Conservative movement, partly because Conservatives are entrepreneurial, independent thinking. The Conservative movement is very much in silos. The provincial Conservative parties do not talk to each other. They don't do much with the federal party. The think tanks and the advocacy groups even don't do a lot together. There's partly out of a fear of losing donors to the other guy. But I think there's a real need for this networking, relationship building. If you're in a think tank, then I would ask you, do you have a relationship with someone in an advocacy group? Do you have a relationship with an elected official? One at the municipal level, one at the provincial level, one at the federal level. This locking people together. And this conferencing that we've been putting on is basically designed to do that, to facilitate networking. Now, as Troy mentioned, we're changing the focus. I'm trying to retire. So we've got these 2 organizations. We've got this charitable foundation, the Manning Foundation, and we're going to keep it and keep the Manning name, and what I do will be connected with that. The book thing is connected with that. But we have this Center for Building Democracy. We're going to change the name of it to Strong and what is it?
It's not announced yet.
Okay. We're going to talk about, but we're going to change the name. We're basically take the name. Yeah. We're going to take the name out of it, but its focus will be almost entirely on this networking. So it'll be networking in it, and Troy is going to be the president of that, and that's going to be its focus. Now, there's another level of this networking. Right now, there are 7 conservatism broadly defined provincial governments: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, New Brunswick. New Brunswick's hanging by a thread because they're going to have a vote on March 10th that they might lose. And on a good day, the CAQ in Quebec and PEI. That's a very powerful force if they work together. Like, our Constitution cannot be substantively amended unless you have the consent of the Parliament of Canada and 7 provinces with 50% of the population, where you're getting half of that formula there. And but they have to work together. If you actually put all that together, if you put those 7 governing Conservative parties together, count up their memberships, their fundraising capacity, and their door-knocking capacity, it's about 3.5 times that of the federal Liberal Party, if they acted as an army. But if they act as individual platoons, it doesn't work. So that's another whole area of networking that hopefully some work can be done on the future. Now the last thing I want to touch on, and this we haven't touched on this as nearly as much in the other places as in Alberta. I've got 2 chapters in there on populism and Western alienation. And the first point I make is that there is no region of North America that has had more experience with populism, populist movements, populist parties and populist governments than Western Canada. If there's any part of North America that ought to understand populism, both its dark side and its good side, it ought to be Western Canada and lessons to be applied. In the turn of the century, the last century and into the 1920s, the Progressive Party of Canada was a populist movement. Progressive in those days did not mean what it means today. It meant democratic. They were a bottom-up movement. They were the ones that got women the vote. They were the ones that got women recognized as persons in Canadian law. All 5 of those Alberta 5, the famous 5 that got statues for in Ottawa, all of them came through populist movements. And the Progressives beget the Farmers' Party. The Farmers' Parties were bottom-up parties. The UFA in Alberta, the Farmers' Government in Manitoba, the Farmers' Government in Ontario. And then the Depression. Depression Party produced 2 parties in Canada. Where were they? Western Canada. And they were bottom-up populist parties. The CCF in Saskatchewan, which became the NDP, Social Credit in Alberta. And then the Reform movement at the end of the 1980s and early 90s. This is, if anybody ought to understand populism, it ought to be us. And so what have we learned from that? Well, here's some of the things I've learned. Now, I've studied these things backwards and forwards. I studied them backwards and forwards before the Reform Party was created. I wanted it to be one of those bottom-up ones rather than a top-down one. Well, here's one of the things we've learned, that the worst possible response by the political establishment and the political elites to a populist movement is to ignore them or to denounce them and say this is a bunch of rabble-rousing, uneducated, ignorant people that don't know what's good for them. If only they'd listen to us, they'd be okay. That's the worst possible reaction. And you know that, because the rank-and-file person says to that type of politicians, you don't trust me, then I don't trust you. You don't respect me, then I don't respect you. This is what's going to give Trump probably a second term. It's what caused this Brexit phenomenon in Britain, the wrong reaction by the political establishment to a bottom-up thing. So what is a better response, or I would say the best response? Well, I think it's got to have 3 components. First is to recognize that these bottom-up political things are legitimate in a free society. They've got their wild and woolly side, but they're a legitimate expression in a democratic. Recognize their legitimacy. The second thing is to identify and address the roots of it. What's causing it? What's at the root of it? And then the third thing is to channel that energy into solutions to the problems that are causing the populist uprising in the first place. The analogy that I've used, suggested to me by oil patch friends, is, in the oil patch there's such a thing as a wildcat well. It's drilled into a formation where you don't know what's down below. And that can turn into a rogue well when you hit a pocket of oil and gas under enormous pressure, and it blows the drilling platform off the wellhead, can catch fire. One of the worst blowouts in Alberta's history was Atlantic number 3, just not far from here. It's south of, just near Leduc. It spilled more oil, 10 times the amount of oil that the Exxon Valdez spilled. It was just so they're very dangerous things, and enormous amount of energy. But if you can control them, it's an enormous amount of wealth and energy there if you can control it. And one of the ways of controlling them, or managing, I wouldn't even say control, is to drill in a relief well from the side. And it's got to connect to whatever causing the rogue well. It's got to connect to that cause, but it takes some of the pressure off and directs it in a way that valves can be installed, and you can eventually bring that wealth under control. And this is a way of respecting the rogue well, but channeling that energy into something constructive. Well, if we try to apply those 3 lessons now to this current discontent in Western Canada, then the first thing would be to recognize the anger that is out there, the frustration that is out there, as legitimate. People got a right to be mad. Look at what's happened to the economy of this province, the contraction of the economy, and the absolute lack of recognition or respect from it, from the central government. People got a right to be mad. It's a legitimate expression. Sure, it's got its wild and woolly side. What politics doesn't, but it's legitimate. And then secondly is to identify and address the root causes. And if I had to use 2 words to describe what the root causes are, I would say it is unfair treatment. Unfair treatment within Confederation. The equalization formula is unfair. It takes away too much from this region, never gives anything back. There's a thing connected to the equalization formula called the Fiscal Stabilization Fund. That was if a province that had contributed to equalization itself got into trouble and couldn't contribute, there was supposed to be a rebate through the Fiscal Stabilization Fund. It was capped a number of years ago, and the cap should be removed. If the cap was removed, Alberta would qualify for a $2.4 billion equalization rebate, but it's not happening. It's unfair. The unfairness of the federal government's inability to create transportation corridors to the Atlantic and the Pacific, unobstructed transportation corridors. It's unfair. We can't. You're an interior province. You've got to get your stuff to Tidewater. That's an unfairness. The unfairness of representation. Representation of Alberta in the House of Commons, in the Senate, in the Federal Civil Service. Unfairness, unfairness, unfairness. That's at the root of this discontent. So. What then is the most appropriate response? Okay, we say it's legitimate, this concern. We say that you can identify what the root causes are, but what's a legitimate response? And now some people, there's a couple of ideas out there, and none of these have reached a decision point. Some people say the response should be for Alberta to secede. And that the strength of that is growing. At this point, and I understand and I sympathize with many people I know that are in the secession movement. At this point, it's a very narrow concept in my judgment. All they're talking about is Alberta seceding, or maybe talking about Alberta and Saskatchewan. That's a very small unit in North America. And the other thing is that the secessionists that I've talked to have not yet thought the whole thing through. If you ask them, where's the constitution of this independent country, they can't give it to you. If you ask them, and how does that get us east-west pipelines, there's no answer to that. If you ask them what kind of currency, would it have a central bank? Would it use the American dollar, the Canadian dollar? These are the first questions the capital markets ask of any new. It's a very incomplete and narrow concept. Now, maybe it'll be fleshed out, I don't know, but at present it isn't. What I think at this stage is a more constructive alternative is for the West, and particularly Alberta, to define what would constitute a fair deal for the West. We say it's unfair. Okay, what would the fair deal look like? And to spell that out. That's what this fair deal panel that the Premier set up is supposed to get at. And I would say not just a fair deal for us. What's a fair deal for the resource-producing regions of this country, which is far bigger than Alberta and Saskatchewan, includes a third of Ontario, includes parts of Quebec. But what constitutes a fair deal? And then the next thing then is to assemble a great coalition of support behind that fair deal. Again, not just Alberta, but the support. You got to get enough clout that the rest of the country can't refuse to give you the fair deal. What this actually involves, and some of you know the history of this, is almost a recreation of the vision of the old Northwest that originated before Alberta and Saskatchewan were provinces. Portrait done. F.W.G. Haltane, the last great premier of the old Northwest Territories. And Haltane had this vision. He had this argument with Prime Minister, with the Prime Minister of the day, that the West should stay as one big coordinated unit, one big unit, to counterbalance Ontario and Quebec. He called themselves a big Westerner. He said people that want to carve it up into either provinces or even a separate country called them little Westerners. He says your vision's too small. And I think you want to create I'm not talking about putting these regions together constitutionally, but I think you need a coalition of people in that whole region. And if you get a coalition of that big, it's actually the size of about 45% of the entire country. The Central Canada and the federal government cannot turn down a request from a region that constitutes almost 50% of the country. But it's got to be coordinated into one big coalition. Haltane wanted to name the one big province Buffalo, which is an interesting thing, but it was a big buffalo. Like it wasn't a pygmy buffalo, it was a big buffalo. And buffalo operate in a herd. You know, there's more than one buffalo. And so I think that's something that can advance things. And then to present the fair deal not just with the pressure of Alberta or Saskatchewan behind it, but with the interest, the coalition of the resource-producing parts of the country to Ottawa and the central government saying this is what we want. Anyway, if you want to do something, then I'll conclude on this. With respect to this alienation and populism in the West, one is contribute to this definition of a fair deal. What constitutes a fair deal? Like, think it through, and you can make submissions to this fair deal committee. Continue to form, contribute to this coalition, broaden your own connections, and then finally help the West make a wise choice between secession on the one hand or virtually reconfederation on the other. So I think that's enough for me. I'm happy to sign any more books that I haven't signed, and some of you got questions, so you can ask me questions while we're signing the books. Thank you very much.